Acting President Choi Sang-mok has spoken of hopes to convince U.S. President Donald Trump against tariffs on South Korean imports into the American market. We have more in Press Perspective today. Hope your work week is off to a good start. It's Monday, March 17th here in Seoul, and you're watching Press Perspective. I'm Min Sunhee. U.S. tariffs and cross-border tensions are among the mounting concerns of the South Korean government, as it also hopes for a quick end to the political turmoil here on the local front. For more, I have Steven Borowiec with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia here in the studio. Steven, welcome back.
Nice to be here.
I also have freelance journalist Raphael Rashid with us. Raphael, it's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Right, Steven, we'll start with you. As I mentioned at the start in that short clip that we saw, the Wall Street Journal published an exclusive interview with Acting President Choi Sang-mok and his thoughts about trade with the U.S. under the Trump administration. For the sake of our viewers who may not have had the chance to read that article, do go over the gist of the article for us and also do include your takeaways.
I think the main takeaway of this story is that it captures Che as kind of at a disconnect from what's happening in Washington at this kind of pivotal time, and how the ongoing political uncertainty in South Korea has left Seoul sort of ill-equipped or ill-positioned to respond to the very significant changes that are taking place in Washington. And the interview demonstrates how South Korea and the U.S. have this long-standing alliance. They have really extensive trade ties. They have a very important defense relationship, and they have like what I think both sides generally feel like has been a mutually beneficial relationship that's gone on for decades. And in Che's responses to the Wall Street Journal, he kind of keeps emphasizing that sort of mutually beneficial nature, and he keeps trying to put forth this message that by working together, these two countries have customarily helped each other out economically and security-wise and all the rest. And so it doesn't really make sense for them to be engaging in a kind of face-off of this nature. But I mean, this is really just bad timing. I mean, nobody really saw this protracted leadership vacuum in South Korea, and I don't think anybody thought that the early stages of the Trump administration would see as many decisive moves as we have seen. And Che is really, the article kind of draws this out too, Che is really, he didn't plan for this himself. Like, he is in a kind of really difficult situation. You know, he didn't get into his current position thinking that, like, as what he once was, he was the third in command after President Yoon and Prime Minister Han Duck-soo, and then once Han got impeached, he had to step up, and he's really in an almost kind of impossible task where he's leading one of the world's larger economies, and he's being asked to address public concerns and government concerns about how the economy is changing and how the security landscape is changing, but he's really kind of limited in his authority. He can't really, the National Assembly is not functioning. He does not have a lot of, despite his title, he does not have a lot of real authority. So it's a testament to this very kind of peculiar and unfortunate situation that he is in and the country is in.
Right. Raphael, this particular article by the Wall Street Journal also includes the findings by a Swiss-based research firm that claims South Korea ranks the most vulnerable with regard to trade risks from the Trump administration. That being said, Raphael, do you suppose the government here has been doing what it can to perhaps better address its future trade ties with the Trump administration going forward?
Perhaps. If we look at this survey in particular, it was published by the Global Trade Alert, and they basically look at all the different countries around the world, 173, and they have these specific red flag areas. And so these red flags cover, like, they measure risks like trade deficits or being subject to scrutiny by US officials, and South Korea has all 5 triggered red flags. So they are basically at the bottom of the list. And I think this vulnerability is precisely why we're seeing such open concern from the South Korean leadership. Acting President Choi has publicly acknowledged that the the arrow of the Trump-led America First policy has begun to zero in on Korea. The recent suggestion, it was the other day in the news, the recent suggestion that Korean tariffs were 4 times higher than the American ones, although this was quickly refuted by South Korean officials as being inaccurate. I think this highlights how the country has become the specific target of the America First narrative. I think the government's response thus far has been measured, perhaps. Maybe it's been proactive, I would say. The Trade Minister, Jong In-kyo, had directly engaged with US counterparts and has requested for kind of exemptions, highlighting South Korea's substantial investments in the American economy. When it comes to acting President Choi, he has outlined some pragmatic strategy, emphasizing the trade surplus is temporary, and offering Korean expertise when it comes to shipbuilding to revive the America's naval industry, and has pointed out to South Korea's over-delivery on promises to purchase US goods. But I think, as Stephen has pointed out, we're at a very unpredictable time with Choi having limited leadership given the ongoing impeachment proceedings, which creates, I guess, somewhat of a diplomatic handicap because it's difficult to know who to talk to. Trump, I think, is maybe reluctant to pick up the phone and talk to Choi when he might be gone in a few days. So I think Trump will be waiting for either the next leader or for Yoon to be reinstated to know who to talk to when it comes to these issues.
Right. And before we delve deeper into South Korea's efforts to deal with its trade concerns, Steven, speaking as a Canadian journalist based here in Seoul, and also for the sake of comparison, could you tell us a bit about Canada's response to US tariffs?
Canada's retaliated with tariffs of their own, I believe, on $20.6 billion worth of US goods. And these have hit key items like aluminum and steel, and computers, and a bunch of it's important to highlight that Canada and the U.S. have like what is arguably the most productive trade relationship in human history. They have this huge, long, mostly unfortified border, and they're two quite wealthy countries, and they're two countries that have a lot of complementary overlap in their economies. Canada is very rich in energy and in manufacturing, and the U.S. produces a lot of consumer goods and all the rest. But Canada seems to have taken this, maybe antagonistic is the right word. They seem to believe that Trump is kind of flexing his muscles and Trump is kind of acting like a bully, and like the way that you must respond to a bully is, not with kindness or not with obsequiousness, but with force, by like meeting force with force. I mean, the premier of the province that I'm from, Premier Ford, has said that he's going to cut, introduce a tariff and possibly even cut off exports of electricity, which go to a few American states, including Minnesota, that are near the border. And like that this tariff war like literally could result in people in some very cold parts of the United States like not having electricity. So this is all, kind of interesting to see. Canada, of course, has this reputation as like the nice country that, doesn't get angry about too much. But having grown up in Canada, I don't find this surprising because I know that in Canada there is this very like deep sense of kind of resentment of being like the junior partner in the relationship with the U.S. Like that this is this much bigger and much more powerful country that, if you're from Canada, you're constantly bombarded with like U.S. media and U.S. Culture, and there's this very strong sense that like the U.S. has this overbearing presence, and a lot of Canadians kind of feel have like over the decades felt kind of disrespected. So I think this was kind of like a spark that lit a lot of lingering resentment. And the Canadian media has reported all these images of, in Ontario, the state liquor authority, which is like the biggest purchaser of alcohol in the world. That's all throughout the provinces. Alcoholic products are like overwhelmingly sold in these government stores, and they've said that they're not going to sell U.S. whiskey or U.S. beer anymore. And so there's these photos that have traveled very widely of like, you know, the California wine section being empty and having nothing in it other than a sign that says like buy Canadian wine instead. I mean, as a Canadian, I do, you know, there is like an emotional part of me that is heartened by seeing like a concerted response and like not a meek response, but you just have to step back and understand that like this economically, this is not going to be good for either country. I have sat in this chair in recent weeks and even months, and when asked about tariffs, I just keep going back to this point that like the economic consensus about tariffs is that they are harmful, that they drive up the prices of consumer goods. They generally do not lead to like the reshoring of manufacturing and like all the things that Trump says that they're going to do. They are harmful. And so we have to just keep in mind that perhaps it hasn't taken effect yet. I mean, we've seen some real havoc in the US stock market, but in the coming months, we can expect some real discouraging economic news. And putting politics aside, really, that's important to like focus that like people's real economic livelihoods are at stake.
Well, Mr. Trump himself has not crossed out the idea of a recession in the US amid his tariff campaign. Raphael, speaking as a British journalist based here in Seoul, what can you tell us about the UK's response to US tariffs?
Yeah, I think the UK has taken maybe a different approach when it comes to the tariffs issue, different from, say, the US or, as we've just seen, Canada. I think I'd characterize it maybe as a measured, if not pragmatic, approach, maybe a cautious approach. So we've seen, say, with the EU, they quickly announced 26 billion euros of retaliatory measures, targeting everything from bourbon whiskey to Harley Davidsons, the motorcycles, of course. But then the British government has, I think, deliberately refrained from these kind of tit-for-tat tariffs. Prime Minister Keir Starmer did express disappointment, of course, but he also emphasized that the UK is rapidly negotiating a wider economic agreement with the US to eliminate additional tariffs. And I think this restraint from the UK authorities comes because of this kind of post-Brexit era that we're living in, this reality. There's a clear recognition that securing a broader, maybe trade deal with the US is a strategic priority, and escalating it into kind of a trade war would jeopardize that goal. I think it was very clear when we saw, say, King Charles inviting Trump for a second state visit, which was basically unprecedented. And the Prime Minister got a lot of criticism for, you know, basically delivering that invitation. But when confronted and asked, you know, do you agree with any of this? Then his simple answer was, they are our closest ally. So whether you like it or not, we basically can't fight this war, I think. And again, coming back to this post-Brexit reality, that said, I don't think I think the impact, of course, has been felt in some ways. The timing, I think, is concerning, as the UK manufacturing output, for instance, has declined in the first quarter of this year, 2025, and this is the first contraction since 2016. Industry bodies like UK Steel have questioned whether Trump realizes whether Britain is an enemy or a friend. So I think, you know, there's plenty of concern on all sides. If you contrast it with the EU, that's been more confrontational, I think, you know, Brussels is maybe working with some kind of economic brinksmanship, perhaps. London, I think they're betting more on diplomacy or negotiations as a solution to go forward. But I think the question remains whether this kind of softer approach will secure the exemptions that they are seeking, or whether it will be interpreted as a kind of form of weakness in what perhaps has become an increasingly transactional era of international trade relations.
All right, I suppose we'll see after April 2nd then. Now, like the UK, South Korea, Stephen, has also refrained from retaliation against Mr. Trump's 25% blanket tariffs on steel and aluminium imports into the US market. Do you suppose the Trump administration's tariffs are perhaps a negotiation strategy? And Stephen, if that is the case, what do you suppose are his intentions with regard to South Korea?
I'm not sure that he knows. I would say a couple of things. Like, I don't think negotiation a negotiation tactic is the word that I would use, because that kind of implies that, negotiation implies formality, it implies like official channels, it implies that like delegations from the two sides would sit down and they would seek to reach some kind of formal and transparent and like public agreement. I don't think that's the way that Trump is working. I don't think Trump has a lot of time for official channels or for like the idea of transparency. I hope I'm not being too cynical, but like my overwhelming impression is that like what Trump and his closest aides are doing is really just setting up the mechanisms of the U.S. state for their own personal gain. And I feel like what he's doing with tariffs is, when he either before he got to office or shortly after, he came out with this like cryptocurrency, like you can buy into this. And that's clearly, like, I don't understand why this wasn't a bigger deal in the US media, because it like creates this like very obvious favor purchasing mechanism. Like Trump could just sit down with anybody and say, okay, well, if you want me to use my influence for your benefit, you buy a bunch of my cryptocurrency, and then it doesn't go down as a bribe, it doesn't go down as any kind of like illicit dealing, it's just this person purchasing this publicly available thing. So I have to assume, and again, I hope I'm not being too cynical, but like this is the best explanation I can think of, is that like by erecting these like very indiscriminate, these kind of like blanket barriers and just saying like, we're not going to grant exemptions, this is just the way it is, everybody has to adjust to it, really what he's doing is he's intending to create panic in all these other economies and to try and induce desperation among all these other economies who really rely on access to the US market. And he's setting himself up as a kind of deal maker, and he's going to say to a country like South Korea or Canada or the UK, if you want access to our market, like tell us what you're going to bring to the table, make it worth our while. A lot of Trump's rhetoric is like, these countries have taken advantage of the US for too long. They've been taking wealth out of the country for too long, and we're going to stop that, and we're going to like set up a trade relationship that is like more beneficial to the US and that is not operating in fealty to the like traditional conventions of international relations. So again, I'm not in the room as Trump and his aides are coming up with this stuff, but like I do feel like it's a combination of like a story that resonates very well with Trump's base, which is come from a lot of like deindustrialized and sort of forgotten parts of the country, and he's telling them like the previous governments have set things up in a way that extracted wealth from where you live. I'm going to extract wealth from the rest of the world and bring it back here. Time will tell just how earnest he is in that explanation, but like it's pretty clear that at least in the short time, him and Elon Musk and all these other people who are carrying this stuff out, they stand to get very wealthy. They already are wealthy, and they stand to get that much wealthier pretty quickly.
Right. Right then, aside from the uncertainty that Mr. Trump is fueling within the global trade arena, Raphael, last week he also raised quite a bit of eyebrows and more concerns here in South Korea by referring to North Korea as a nuclear power yet again and touting his very close ties with Kim Jong-un. Now, his earlier references to North Korea as a nuclear power, including that by, I believe, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, they were dismissed by some pundits as perhaps a slip of the tongue. Are we now looking at a potential shift in U.S. strategy with regard to North Korea?
I think we're looking at something a bit more nuanced than a simple slip of the tongue, as you put it. I think when President Trump referred to North Korea as a nuclear power for, I think, the second time since inauguration, and praising his relationship with Kim Jong-un, I think it appears to be part of a more, I would say, calculated signaling strategy. What's particularly telling in this context, in the Oval Office meeting with NATO Secretary General, Trump didn't just casually mention North Korea's nuclear status. He explicitly stated, Kim Jong-un has a lot of nuclear weapons, by the way, a lot, and grouped North Korea alongside other de facto nuclear states like India and Pakistan. And while the White House, of course, will then issue a kind of standard clarification that Trump will pursue complete denuclearization, this repeated use of terminology, I think, suggests a potential evolution in his approach. The administration has been shifting from historically unsuccessful goal of total denuclearization to maybe a more pragmatic arms control maybe framework. And I think the timing is, of course, significant as well when these comments come as North Korea is partnering up more and more with Russia, having this military relationship with Russia, and has rejected denuclearization as something that is outdated and absurd. So I think Trump may be attempting to establish grounds for potential negotiations going forward, rather than just eliminating Kim Jong-un's nuclear arsenal altogether. So I think while official policy maybe remains unchanged on paper, the complete denuclearization, I think the rhetorical shift signals maybe a potential recalibration in how the US approaches North Korea when it comes to these issues. And I think we will probably see phone calls, or who knows, maybe another meeting with Kim Jong-un going forward. I think there's plenty on the table, and we have yet to see what will happen. But I think anything can happen at this moment because it's Trump.
And against this backdrop then, Stephen, what do you suppose are the broader implications of acknowledging North Korea as a nuclear power, especially by Mr. Trump himself?
I'm not sure that Trump either knows or cares what the diplomatic implications of using that language is. Trump doesn't think or act like a statesman. I think he thinks much more like a businessman. So I think from a businessman's perspective, I think he just looks at North Korea and he says, they have nuclear weapons, therefore they are a nuclear power. It's kind of diplomatic wishful thinking to carry on as though this is somehow not a nuclear power when they already have all these weapons and everybody knows that. So I think Trump just doesn't see a lot of value in the conventions that surround these kinds of discussions. I mean, I think surely he has people on his team, as Raphael laid out, they've kind of backtracked from this a bit. I'm surely he has people on his team who are saying, slow down, our long-standing goal here has been to pursue the denuclearization of North Korea, and if you go around acknowledging them as a nuclear power, it sends the message that you are no longer implying that they are illegitimate possessors of these weapons, that they are a kind of legitimate nuclear power. I think that's at the basis of it, but I think at the same time, as Raphael laid out, it might also kind of strengthen his negotiation hand as a gesture of flattery, maybe he could sit down across from Kim Jong-un and he'd say, hey man, I know you're a nuclear power, we're a nuclear power too, we're here negotiating as equals. Let's see how we can benefit each other, let's see if we can make a deal. So I think it mostly just comes down to that. I don't know that there are any immediate implications of this. What I think will determine the implications of it is does he act on this? Does he initiate or does he agree to negotiations with North Korea on the basis, with something written into the documents of the meeting that we recognize your status as a nuclear power. As long as this is being kind of brought forth and then walked back as a slip of the tongue, it probably doesn't change anything fundamentally, but that in itself could also change. So
for now, we can look at it as a form of perhaps sweet-talking Kim Jong-un into coming back to the negotiating table.
What's more flattering than you're a nuclear power?
Well, this is a topic we'll probably be talking about in the days ahead as well. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this edition. So, Stephen, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Raphael, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you very much.
Right, well, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.